Alright everybody, today we're going to be building this Vietnam era footlocker out of 1/2-inch plywood. Obviously locking hardware, hinges, and these interesting corner brackets, which is what kind of make this unique. It makes it so you can easily put this thing together really fast. I just use glue and screws. Traditionally they used rivets for a lot of these connections, which I don't have a rivet gun, so I just use screws. Okay, so here's a couple shots of what an authentic Vietnam era footlocker looks like. They are clearly very utilitarian and built to last. This one is holding up well, even with decades of hard use and travel. I'm making my variant out of 1/2-inch thick plywood, and you can see here it only uses 3/4 of a sheet of plywood. Also, when the top opens, you can see it has an insert that holds smaller items. This is supported by 2 bottom supports. I'm going to include plans below and a SketchUp file in the video description, so check that out if you're interested. With the drawings done, I started to cut everything down. Now I'm using a track saw, but you could just as easily use a table saw or a circular saw with a straight edge or even a jigsaw if you wanted. And that pink thing on the bottom there that I'm cutting into is foam, which just helps me support the workpiece while I'm cutting into it. For a detailed layout of the cuts I'm doing here, you can check out the SketchUp file, but essentially I cut the plywood into thirds, then I cut the top, the bottom, the insert sides, and 2 support pieces from the first third. Then the rest of the pieces came from the second third. For some of the cuts I used my circular saw if they were too small to easily cut with the track saw. Forgot to film cutting the handles, but for those I used some scrap poplar that I had sitting around, but you can really use anything since it's going to be painted anyway. With everything cut down, I moved to assembly. Now, it's a good idea to sand everything right now since you have easy access. Once the brackets go on, it's a little bit harder. I then measured the location for each bracket. The original lockers used really thin brackets that were held on by nails and rivets. I couldn't find anything exactly like those, so I got some thicker brackets and I'm using 1/2-inch wood screws to attach them. The brackets really just hold everything together while you glue it up, so they're not super critical from a structural perspective. I found it was helpful to screw in all the bottom brackets and the remainder of the side pieces first, then it was just a matter of gluing and screwing each piece in. You'll see I use clamps to hold things in place, but this is definitely not necessary as you could just really wing it yourself, or if you have someone else to hold it up while you're driving the screws, that helps. I will say this is incredibly satisfying to get things cut and the box put together in like an hour or 2. You don't really need to worry about glue or any of the other kind of fine details because they're going to be painted anyway. These are also meant to be utilitarian, so some of the roughness actually can add some nice aesthetic to it. And there we go, the base is already together, and while I speeded this up to like 20x, I think you get the point. The inserts in the originals are also held together with brackets and rivets, but I decided to just use glue. I'd suggest that you would make the insert significantly looser than I made mine, so you can put it in and take it out of the box easier. Mine's pretty snug and the air pressure actually makes it a little difficult to take it out. Once the sides dried, I glued and clamped them to the bottom piece. Also on my version, I added a support strip to the top so that I could have some extra wood to drive the hinges into. This is definitely not required, but it adds additional strength. I just screwed that piece in after gluing it. With that done, I measured out the spacing for the hinges, then added another strip to the back of the box for the hinges to anchor to. I measured out the locations for the latch pieces and then started adding another backer. However, at this point I didn't really like where things were going aesthetically, so I removed that piece. While checking out the insert and the new piece I added, I realized I might have a bit of a problem. Luckily I was able to pry that piece off before it dried, and I installed it on the top for some added symmetry and also a place to anchor the latch to. The hinges I used didn't fit perfectly, so I had to drill an additional hole in each to account for the thickness of the top. Then I used some clamps to hold things in place, and I installed the hinges and the latch mechanism. At this point, I realized I forgot to install the longer screws I had to take advantage of that extra thickness on the top, so I replaced a couple of them. I cut 2 holes in the top insert to allow airflow and act as handles using my Forstner bit. I'm going to be using the insert supports to anchor the handles. This isn't really necessary as the glue should definitely be enough, but I figured I'm going to put them at this height anyway, so why not screw from the inside out? That way it makes it easier to hold the handle on. So to do this, I screwed in all the screws part way, making sure that the tips were sticking out just a little bit so that when I pressed it into the wood it would hold there, and then I glued and screwed everything in. Somehow I managed to attach one of the inserts about a 1/4 inch lower than the other one, so I think I was rushing, but anyway, I'm going to have to go back and add another piece to level that out. I added some strips of plywood to the bottom of my box to keep the screws and brackets from scraping into the floor. This is a problem in the original Footlockers, so I definitely would suggest doing this. Otherwise you're going to have to be really careful on your floor and put some other type of foot there. In order to keep someone from just unscrewing my hinges and getting to all my gold bullion or whatever I'm keeping in here, I filled the screws with superglue. This worked really well and is a nice alternative to using the rivets in the originals. However, I did not do this with all of the screws since the sides were glued together anyway. I decided to add another handle hole to the insert. I just cleaned it up after it splintered some with glue and a clamp. Again, it's going to get painted, so I didn't even notice this once everything was done. Next, I sanded everything, but I probably should have been a bit more thorough since I found that the flat army green spray paint I was using really absorbed into the plywood and made it difficult. So I went back and sanded in between coats to kind of get rid of some of that excess. I think if I did this again, I'd either apply a coat of water-based poly first and then spray it, or just use some regular kind of like house paint, and I think that would absorb better. I ended up using about 5 cans. And I also went back and applied a satin clear coat, which helped out a lot. Probably I would have just picked that to start and used satin instead of flat. But you know the saying of hindsight being 20/20 and whatnot, so you can learn from my mistake. Finally, I cut out a stencil for the US logo and I applied that with some black satin spray paint. I used some painter's tape to help keep things flat, and then I applied some 2-sided tape so that it would keep it nice and flush with the back and reduce the spray out when I applied it. With that, it was done. I think it turned out really well, but you know, there's definitely a couple things that could probably be fixed, like that crooked top insert and the problem with the airflow. But, you know, anyway, this was a really fun, cheap project. I think it was about probably $40 or $50. And if you have a bit more patience than I do, you would end up with something even nicer. That said, I think it does a really good job of capturing the aesthetic of the original Footlockers. Don't forget to check out the plans in the description. Also, if you liked the video, hit the thumbs up and subscribe to see more content. Anyway, I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks.